The sky looks calm, blue, open, uninterrupted, yet, above our heads, two worlds move through the same air, one civilian, one military, sharing space, sharing risk, sharing power. A commercial jet cruises steadily at altitude. Elsewhere, radar lights up with movements never shown on passenger screens. Different missions, different priorities, one sky, and when tension rises on the ground, the air above begins to bend. Across the world, conflicts no longer stop at borders. They stretch upward, reshaping flight paths, closing corridors, forcing civilian aircraft into longer, riskier journeys. What once felt neutral becomes contested. What once felt safe becomes conditional. Stay with us, because this story is not only about planes. This is about civil aviation and military airspace colliding in an age of conflict, about flight safety, sovereignty, and trust, and how modern wars quietly redraw the invisible lines in the sky. As airspace restrictions expand and routes are rerouted, the consequences reach far beyond cockpit decisions. They touch passengers, governments, and the fragile confidence that keeps global aviation moving. Because when power enters the sky, neutrality disappears. And when the sky is no longer neutral, neither is the world beneath it. The question is no longer whether civilian and military flights can coexist, it is who decides the rules, and who bears the cost when those rules change. And in that shared airspace, the truth about power begins to reveal itself. For most passengers, the sky feels seamless, a single corridor of air, calm, ordered, predictable. But that calm is an illusion. Above every civilian flight lies a layered architecture. Invisible lines, reserved zones, shifting permissions, where commercial air traffic and military operations coexist by design, not by chance. This shared airspace is governed by rules, coordination, and trust. When it works, nobody notices. When it fails, the consequences are immediate. In times of stability, the system is elegant. Civilian aircraft follow published airways. Military flights operate within designated zones or under coordinated clearance. Notifications are issued, controllers communicate. The sky becomes a managed commons, quietly balancing speed, safety, and sovereignty. It is a choreography refined over decades. NOTAMs, formal notices to pilots, signal temporary changes. Restricted areas appear and disappear. Exercises conclude. Corridors reopen. From the cockpit, it feels routine. From the ground, it feels invisible. This is the fragile order that keeps millions moving every day. Yet this order depends on one condition above all others: restraint. Because civilian aviation is built on predictability. Pilots trust the information they receive. Airlines trust that airspace closures will be clear, timely, and limited. Passengers trust that the route planned on the ground will still exist in the sky. Military aviation operates differently. It prioritizes readiness, secrecy, and speed. In moments of tension, those priorities rise sharply, and the balance begins to tilt. The overlap is not accidental, it is structural. Every state controls the air above its territory. That control is a core expression of sovereignty. In peacetime, it is shared carefully with civilian operators. In uncertainty, it is reclaimed quickly. And that is where the fault line runs, because the same sky that carries families, workers, and students also carries power. Surveillance flights, patrols, exercises, signals not meant for civilian eyes. The system holds as long as coordination holds. When it weakens, ambiguity fills the gap. A delayed notice, an expanded restricted zone, a flight forced to reroute with little warning. Small changes, each rationale on its own, begin to accumulate. The sky remains open, but less certain. Shared, but no longer equal. What once felt like a neutral passage becomes a space of calculation. Airlines weigh risk against cost. Controllers adapt in real time. Pilots rely not only on instruments, but judgment. The order still exists, but it is under strain. And when that strain meets rising geopolitical tension, the invisible lines in the sky begin to move faster than anyone on board can see. Because the moment restraint gives way to urgency, The balance between civilian safety and military priority is tested. The moment conflict enters the equation, the sky begins to change shape, not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. Airspace that once flowed in straight lines starts to curve. Corridors close without ceremony. New restrictions appear, then widen. What was routine yesterday becomes provisional today. Civilian flight paths stretch longer, detouring around zones of uncertainty, drawn not by weather, but by power. In regions touched by tension, airlines respond first with caution. Routes are reviewed, risk assessments updated, crews briefed with new warnings. A single notice can reroute hundreds of flights, adding hours, fuel costs and fatigue, all to avoid a sky that no longer feels predictable. From the cockpit, the change is subtle but constant. From the operations room, it is relentless. Conflict does not need to spill directly into airspace to affect it. The possibility alone is enough. When military exercises intensify, when surveillance increases, when borders harden, civilian aviation adjusts in anticipation. Safety margins expand. Direct routes disappear. Efficiency gives way to prudence. The sky is not closed. It is distorted. Recent years have shown how quickly this distortion spreads. Escalations on the ground have triggered sudden airspace closures, forcing commercial aircraft to divert thousands of kilometers. Airlines have suspended services overnight, not because of incidents in the air, but because uncertainty below made calculation impossible. And with every diversion, the cost accumulates. Fuel burn rises. Schedules unravel. Smaller carriers absorb losses they can least afford. Passengers endure longer journeys with fewer explanations. Trust, the quiet currency of aviation, begins to thin. More troubling still are the moments when civilian and military operations come dangerously close. Near misses, unclear transponder signals, aircraft operating under different rules, different assumptions, in the same vertical space. Each incident is described carefully, cautiously. No accusations, no conclusions. Just the acknowledgement that shared airspace under strain carries risk that no checklist can fully eliminate. This is the heart of the tension. Military necessity prioritizes speed, secrecy, and readiness. Civilian aviation depends on transparency, coordination, and predictability. In conflict, these logics collide. What is essential for one becomes destabilizing for the other. So the question of priority rises, quietly but insistently. When security demands override civilian patterns, who decides how much risk is acceptable? When information is partial by design, how does a civilian system built on openness adapt? When routes are redrawn for power, who carries the consequences? The answers are never announced from the sky. They are felt in longer journeys, higher fares, and the growing sense that neutrality has limits. And as the airspace continues to bend under pressure, another layer of impact begins to surface, one measured not in miles or minutes, but in confidence. Because once passengers begin to doubt the sky itself, the crisis moves beyond navigation and into trust. As detours multiply, the logic of aviation shifts. What once prioritized efficiency now prioritizes avoidance. Airlines redraw maps nightly. Dispatch teams monitor advisories in real time. A corridor deemed acceptable at dawn can be questioned by dusk. Decisions are made quickly, often with incomplete information, because waiting carries its own risks. For passengers, the experience feels abstract. A longer flight, a late arrival, a vague announcement about operational reasons. But behind those words lies a cascade of judgment calls shaped by military movement, intelligence assessments, and political signals never meant for civilian ears. This is where opacity becomes dangerous. Civil aviation relies on clarity, shared data, common standards, predictable rules. In conflict, information fragments. Some details cannot be disclosed. Others arrive late. The gap between what is known and what is needed widens, and civilian systems are forced to operate inside that gap. Controllers manage complexity with professionalism, but the margin narrows. Pilots follow procedures, yet must remain alert to anomalies. Airlines absorb cost quietly, knowing that public confidence is fragile and easily shaken. And still, the airspace remains shared. Military flights may fly without standard transponders. Exercises can overlap with civilian corridors. Emergency restrictions expand faster than commercial schedules can adapt. Each measure may be justified individually. Together, they alter the character of the sky. The distortion is cumulative. Routes that once connected regions directly now snake around invisible threats. Travel times lengthen. Carbon emissions rise. Insurance premiums creep upward. Smaller carriers face disproportionate pressure, forced to choose between safety margins and financial survival. None of this makes headlines on its own. But taken together, it marks a turning point. Because when conflict reshapes airspace repeatedly, neutrality erodes. The sky stops being a shared utility and starts feeling like a contested domain. Civilian aviation becomes reactive, always adjusting to forces it does not control, and that reaction carries a cost beyond logistics. Public trust begins to thin, not through panic, but through uncertainty. People wonder what is being avoided, why routes change so often, whether safety is being compromised or protected. The absence of clear answers invites speculation, and speculation corrodes confidence. This is the quiet peak of the crisis, not a single closure, not a single incident, but a sustained pressure where military urgency steadily overrides civilian stability. The sky does not collapse, it tightens, and as that pressure builds, attention shifts from routes and risks to something more fundamental: the responsibility of states to protect those who fly through airspace shaped by power. Because when safety depends on decisions made far from the cabin, the question of trust becomes unavoidable. Safety in the sky is built on something fragile. Not steel, not engines. Trust. Every civilian flight depends on an assumption that the information guiding it is complete, timely, and honest. Pilots trust what they are told. Controllers trust what they see. Passengers trust a system they will never fully understand and should never have to question. That trust is the true infrastructure of aviation. When military activity intensifies, that infrastructure is tested, not always by direct threat, but by uncertainty. Information becomes partial by necessity. Some movements cannot be disclosed, some intentions remain classified. Civilian systems designed for transparency are forced to operate alongside silence. This is where risk quietly grows. Aviation safety is not only about avoiding danger, it is about anticipating it. Civilian operations rely on predictability, on knowing where hazards are and where they will not be. When airspace restrictions expand rapidly, when advisories change without explanation, predictability fractures. The radar still works, the procedures still apply, but confidence thins. International bodies issue guidance. Risk maps are updated. Airlines consult multiple sources before committing to a route. Yet even the most robust systems cannot fully compensate for ambiguity created by conflict. When military and civilian priorities diverge, the burden of adjustment almost always falls on civilian operators. And with that burden comes a human cost. Cabin crews fly longer hours. Pilots manage fatigue under extended routings. Passengers endure uncertainty without context. Families ask why a journey within the regions now takes half a day longer than before. The answers are careful, limited, and often unsatisfying. Public confidence does not collapse in a single moment. It erodes. Each unexplained diversion, each sudden suspension, each report of a near encounter described in cautious language. Over time, the question shifts. Not, is this flight safe? But who is responsible for keeping it so? This is where the debate widens beyond aviation. Because airspace is governed by states, and states are accountable to people. When military necessity reshapes civilian risk, responsibility cannot remain abstract. Safety becomes inseparable from governance, and governance from legitimacy. In parts of the world marked by political transition, this tension resonates deeply. Leaders who speak about sovereignty and control Figures such as Ibrahim Traoré are often responding to a broader public unease, the sense that critical systems are shaped by forces beyond civilian consent. In the sky, that unease becomes tangible. When people feel that safety decisions are opaque, trust weakens. When trust weakens, compliance becomes fragile. And when compliance falters, even the most advanced safety frameworks strain. This is the civilian cost of overlapping power, not measured in incidents but in confidence, not counted in statistics but felt in hesitation. The sky can remain technically safe while psychologically uncertain, and that gap matters, because aviation does not function on rules alone. It functions on belief, and once belief begins to waver, the challenge ahead is no longer purely technical. It becomes a question of authority, accountability, and who ultimately owns the risk carried by those in the cabin. Airspace is not empty. It is owned. Every nation holds sovereignty not only over its land and seas but over the air above them, an invisible border enforced by law, radar, and political will. In calm times, that sovereignty feels administrative. In moments of tension, it becomes absolute. The decision to open or close the sky is among the most powerful tools a state possesses. When governments restrict airspace, they do more than reroute aircraft. They send signals. They assert authority. They redraw the boundaries of access without moving a single soldier on the ground. Civilian aviation, bound by safety and compliance, must respond immediately. No negotiation, no appeal. This is where military priority reveals its full weight, because when security considerations rise, civilian needs are subordinated by design. Commercial schedules yield to patrols. Predictable corridors give way to restricted zones. What is framed as temporary often stretches longer than expected, reshaping patterns of movement in ways that outlast the original crisis. The sky becomes a message. To allies, it signals alignment. To rivals, resolve. To civilians, uncertainty. In smaller or strategically exposed states, this imbalance is felt most sharply. Countries with limited leverage in global security frameworks experience airspace decisions made around them rather than with them. Even nations far from active combat zones can find their skies affected by regional power dynamics, as routes shift and priorities change. Places like Burkina Faso illustrate this reality, not as an aviation case study, but as a reminder that sovereignty is rarely exercised in isolation. When global tensions rise, even distant airspace becomes part of a larger equation shaped elsewhere. This is the moral age of the issue, because sovereignty without capacity becomes vulnerability, and capacity without accountability becomes risk. When military logic dominates the sky, civilian governance must work harder to protect transparency, trust, and legitimacy. The challenge is not to deny security concerns, it is to balance them. A state's right to defend its airspace carries a parallel responsibility to minimize civilian harm, to communicate clearly, and to preserve confidence in shared systems that cross borders daily. When that balance fails, power may be asserted, but at the cost of credibility, and credibility, once weakened, is difficult to restore. The sky does not argue, it complies, but compliance does not mean consent. As military influence continues to shape civilian rules, the air above us becomes a mirror, reflecting not just threats, but priorities. What a nation protects first, what it explains later, and what it expects civilians to accept without question. And in that reflection, the final test of sovereignty comes into view, not whether a state can close its skies, but whether it can keep them legitimate in the eyes of those who must fly beneath its power. The future of the sky will not be decided by technology alone, not by radar resolution, satellite coverage, or smarter algorithms. It will be decided by choices. Modern conflict is no longer confined to borders or battlefields. It moves through signals, surveillance, drones, and data, extending military logic into airspace that civilian aviation once treated as neutral. As this shift accelerates, the overlap between defense and transport becomes structural, not exceptional. Civilian aircraft now fly through skies shaped by anticipation rather than reaction. Routes are planned not only around weather and terrain, but around political tension, intelligence assessments, and unspoken red lines. Safety margins expand as trust contracts. This is the paradox of the moment. Security grows more visible. Freedom of movement grows more conditional. New technologies promise awareness, but also enable control. Integrated radar systems see more, track more, predict more. Yet the same tools that enhance safety can also centralize power, narrowing who decides and who is informed. The line between protection and restriction blurs. For passengers, this reality remains largely invisible. For states, it is unavoidable. Governments face a dilemma that will define the coming decade: how to protect their skies without hollowing them out, a shared civic space; how to integrate military necessity without erasing civilian confidence; how to defend sovereignty while preserving legitimacy. There are no simple answers. What is clear is that fragmentation carries its own danger. If each conflict redraws the sky independently, global aviation becomes a patchwork of exceptions, detours, and uncertainties. Efficiency collapses, costs rise, trust erodes further, but coordination offers another path: transparent communication, clear risk thresholds, civil-military integration built on accountability rather than secrecy alone. International norms that recognize security realities without sacrificing civilian safety. These are not technical ideals, they are political commitments. The sky, after all, connects everyone. It does not belong to one sector or one moment of fear. It is a shared system sustained by restraint, cooperation, and trust, or undermined by their absence. As the world enters an era of persistent tension, the air above us will continue to reflect what lies beneath. The priorities we choose, the fears we elevate, the values we defend under pressure. Because in the end, the sky does not lie. It mirrors the ground below, faithfully, silently, and without judgment. And what it reflects next will depend on whether power learns to coexist with responsibility or insists on flying alone. The sky was never empty. It was only quiet enough to seem neutral. Today, that illusion is fading. As military flight paths intersect with civilian corridors, the air above us reveals a deeper truth. Power does not stop at the border, and neither does its shadow. When conflict bends the sky, it reshapes more than routes and schedules. It reshapes trust. This is why the question matters. Safety is not merely technical, it is relational. It rests on transparency, predictability, and the belief that civilian lives are not secondary to strategic urgency. When that belief weakens, aviation continues to function. But confidence does not. Across regions and political contexts, debates about sovereignty and control have intensified. Figures such as Ibrahim Traoré have come to symbolize a wider insistence that authority must be accountable and that security cannot be detached from legitimacy. Not as an aviation doctrine, but as a signal of a world asking who decides and who bears the risk. Even nations distant from major theaters of war are not insulated. Airspace is interconnected. Decisions taken elsewhere ripple outward, touching routes, costs, and confidence. In places like Burkina Faso, the sky becomes a reminder that sovereignty is exercised within a global system where power overlaps and consequences travel. The path forward is not to deny security realities, nor to pretend the sky can remain untouched by conflict. It is to insist on balance, civil-military coordination that prioritizes clarity, international norms that protect civilians, and governance that treats transparency as a form of safety. Because the sky is more than a domain, it is a mirror. It reflects how we weigh fear against freedom, how we balance urgency with responsibility, how power chooses to coexist or collide with the everyday lives moving beneath it. If this story resonates, remain part of the conversation. The next chapter will be written not only by those who command the skies, but by those who demand they remain worthy of trust. And as the word keeps flying through shared air, the final test endures. Can power protect without eclipsing the people it claims to serve?